Tonight we begin with a development that US officials had feared, warned about, and desperately prepared for, a military buildup that unfolded not over months but in mere days, days that saw tens of thousands of Russian troops repositioned to forward staging areas, days that saw heavy weapons systems moved within striking distance of critical Ukrainian positions, days that triggered emergency briefings at the highest levels of the Pentagon and prompted urgent calls between Washington and its NATO allies. What Russia did this week crossed a line that American defense officials had hoped would hold, and when that line broke, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with precision, speed, and devastating effectiveness. For weeks now, there had been signals, not from official diplomatic channels, not from formal military communiques, just signals, that Russia was preparing something unprecedented in scale and ambition. Russia has been aggressive, yes, but they have been remarkably predictable in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain pattern, a rhythm, almost a script that Western intelligence agencies had learned to read with increasing accuracy. But what set off alarm bells in the Pentagon this week was that the pattern went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian military activity know the indicators all too well, the chatter on military radio frequencies that typically precedes major operations, the movement of supply convoys carrying ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies, the positioning of field hospitals and casualty evacuation units, the sudden activation of reserve formations that had been held in rear areas, the increased activity at air bases and ammunition storage facilities. All of that went quiet, and whenever Russia goes quiet, it means something is about to get very, very loud. This silence was different from the usual operational security measures. It was comprehensive, it was coordinated, and it lasted just long enough to make everyone in Washington genuinely nervous about what was coming next. Early Tuesday morning, satellite reconnaissance detected what analysts described as a massive and unprecedented repositioning of Russian ground forces, including armored divisions and artillery brigades that had not been activated in over 18 months. These are the kinds of assets that Russia only deploys when they are signaling something very specific, a major offensive push designed to capture significant territory, a strategic attempt to encircle Ukrainian forces, or preparation for a prolonged and intensive campaign that could fundamentally reshape the front lines. Western military observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Russia was fundamentally changing its military posture. And when a nuclear-armed power shifts its posture without explanation, even by a small margin, the Pentagon pays very close attention. Intelligence reports indicated that Russia had moved at least 40,000 additional troops into forward positions. They had repositioned hundreds of tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and self-propelled artillery pieces. They had activated command and control nodes that had been dormant since the early months of the invasion. This was not a drill. This was not posturing. This was preparation for something significant. The warning issued by the Pentagon tonight was not normal, it was not routine, it was not symbolic, it was urgent. Official after official emerging from classified briefings at the Pentagon and the White House described Russia's move in stark terms: provocative, destabilizing, and perhaps most importantly, actionable, meaning it represented a clear and present threat that required immediate response rather than diplomatic deliberation. But intimidation tactics only work if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response today was among the most comprehensive, coordinated, and strategically significant military operations we've seen in over 2.5 years of this brutal conflict. Here's what we know. Within hours of confirming the Russian buildup through their own intelligence sources and information shared by Western allies, Ukraine launched a series of precision strikes deep behind enemy lines. These weren't the standard drone harassment operations that have become routine on both sides of the front. These were ATACMS ballistic missiles and Storm Shadow cruise missiles, sophisticated Western-supplied weapons systems that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to fundamentally reshape the battlefield equation. The targets were carefully selected, the timing was precise, and the message was unmistakable. Tonight, Ukrainian military command confirmed that their forces launched coordinated strikes on Russian logistics hubs across multiple regions, including a major ammunition depot in Voronezh Oblast that had recently been reactivated for what analysts believe was preparation for the anticipated spring offensive. Ukraine struck before Russia could consolidate their repositioned forces into a coherent offensive formation. They hit fuel storage facilities that were essential for maintaining armored operations. They hit command and control centers where senior officers were coordinating the buildup. They hit rail junctions and marshalling yards that were actively moving heavy armor and artillery to forward positions. They hit air defense radar installations that Russia had been using to protect the concentration of forces. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of Russia's massive buildup, the logistics backbone that would have made any offensive operation actually possible. This is what made the Pentagon's warning so urgent in its delivery and so dire in its assessment. Russia's repositioning wasn't just symbolic saber-rattling, it was actionable preparation for military operations. It represented the kind of move that could fundamentally alter the front lines, potentially encircle Ukrainian forces and change the trajectory of the entire war if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that reality fully, responded with overwhelming force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't launch random attacks across the entire front line hoping something would hit. They didn't waste precious Western-supplied munitions on secondary or tertiary targets. They hit the arteries that feed Russian military operations. They hit the nerve centers that coordinate Russian command decisions. And here's where the story becomes even more strategically significant. Pentagon officials and intelligence analysts now believe that Russia's latest move was designed to test the resolve of both Ukraine and its Western allies. After months of delayed military aid packages and mounting political uncertainty in Washington and European capitals, Russia wanted to see whether Ukraine would hesitate, whether Western support would finally waver after years of sustained commitment. But instead, the exact opposite happened. Ukraine didn't freeze under pressure. They launched a response that was so swift, so precise, so devastatingly effective that even hardened Russian military commanders were forced to take notice. You don't get Moscow's attention easily. They have grown accustomed to dismissing Ukrainian capabilities and Western warnings alike. But today, Kyiv got their attention. Defense analysts speaking with major news outlets under conditions of anonymity described Russia's repositioning as coercive escalation, a military strategy designed to intimidate and extract concessions without fully committing to an actual offensive operation. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and willing to respond to threats with decisive action. Their strikes were not only militarily effective, they were timed so precisely that Russian forces had absolutely no opportunity to disperse their concentrated assets or relocate their vulnerable logistics infrastructure to safer positions. That timing matters enormously because it reveals something critical about Ukraine's intelligence capabilities and their coordination with Western partners. It shows that Ukraine is not simply reacting to Russian moves after the fact, they are anticipating them. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening hours, we learned more about the full scale of Ukraine's comprehensive response. Ukrainian long-range drones carried out attacks on at least 4 separate Russian military installations deep inside Russian territory, forcing emergency evacuations and triggering massive secondary explosions that burned through the night and could be seen on satellite imagery from space. Ukrainian ground forces simultaneously targeted forward observation posts and reconnaissance positions that Russian forces had established within the last 72 hours, eliminating Russian eyes on Ukrainian defensive positions. Special operations units operating behind enemy lines reportedly disrupted critical communication networks and fiber optic cables used by Russia to coordinate their repositioned forces across multiple sectors. Ukrainian artillery and rocket forces struck ammunition pre-positioning sites that would have sustained any Russian offensive operation for weeks. This wasn't just tactical retaliation for Russian provocations. This wasn't just defensive action to protect Ukrainian territory. This was strategic initiative on a scale we haven't seen in months. This was active battlefield shaping designed to prevent Russian operations before they could begin. And battlefield shaping is the one thing Russia has consistently struggled to achieve since their catastrophic failed advance on Kyiv in the earliest days of the February 2022 invasion. For every territorial advance they have made at enormous cost in men and equipment, Ukraine has countered with something that complicates their logistics, disrupts their command structure, or demoralizes their forces. Remember, Russia thought Ukraine would collapse in 3 days. They thought Western support would evaporate after the first difficult winter of energy shortages and economic pressure. They thought their sheer numerical advantage in personnel and artillery would eventually, inevitably overwhelm Ukrainian resistance through attrition. They thought sanctions would cripple Western economies more than Russia's own. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine is hitting deeper into Russian territory than ever before, striking targets that Moscow once believed were completely safe. Western weapons are arriving in greater quantities and with expanded permissions for their use. Russian forces are struggling to protect their own rear areas and logistics infrastructure from Ukrainian strikes, and the Russian economy is showing signs of strain that even the Kremlin can no longer completely hide from domestic audiences. What makes this moment so critical and so genuinely dangerous is that Russia's latest military move happened at a time when Vladimir Putin is under immense and mounting domestic pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Hardliners and military bloggers want total victory and the complete annexation of all territories Russia has claimed, regardless of the cost. Pragmatists in the Russian business community and foreign policy establishment want a negotiated settlement before the economy deteriorates further. Military commanders want more resources, more equipment, and fewer political constraints on how they conduct operations. Ordinary Russian families want some kind of resolution after years of sacrifice and mounting casualties that the government refuses to acknowledge honestly. Putin is attempting to balance these contradictory demands while simultaneously managing a war that has already cost far more in blood and treasure than anyone in Moscow anticipated when they launched this invasion. And when leaders in that position make sudden, dramatic military moves, they're rarely doing it from a position of strength. They're doing it from pressure, they're doing it from vulnerability, they're doing it because they need to change the narrative, shift the momentum, or create new facts on the ground before their position deteriorates further. The Pentagon's warning, now circulating through NATO channels, allied intelligence services, and partner nations around the world, was designed to signal unmistakably that the United States is not willing to allow Russia to fundamentally alter the battlefield equation through military intimidation. Senior defense officials said plainly that Russia's repositioning was inconsistent with any genuine interest in de-escalation or diplomatic resolution. That is carefully calibrated diplomatic language for a much simpler message. We know exactly what you're doing, and we're not going to let it work. You don't usually hear that tone from Pentagon officials unless something genuinely serious is at stake and American credibility is on the line. The warning was accompanied by announcements of accelerated weapons deliveries to Ukraine and increased intelligence sharing among NATO allies. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the nation in a brief but defiant speech tonight, speaking directly to camera with the composed intensity that has become his trademark communication style throughout this war. He said, "They expected us to be afraid. Instead, we gave them every reason to reconsider their calculations." He said, "Every weapon they move toward our borders will become a target before it has the chance to fire a single shot at our people." And he said, Ukraine does not wait passively for threats to become attacks. We act first. We strike first. We defend our nation on our terms, not theirs. These are not mere rhetorical flourishes designed for international audiences. These are operational statements from a wartime leader who understands just how high the stakes have become and how narrow the margins for error truly are. Here's what makes the current situation even more concerning for Western analysts and policymakers. Russia's latest military repositioning wasn't an isolated action. Along with the massive ground force movements that triggered the Pentagon warning Russian naval assets in the Black Sea simultaneously increased their activity near critical commercial shipping lanes, raising concerns about potential disruptions to Ukrainian grain exports. Wagner-affiliated mercenaries and Russian military advisors reportedly began moving equipment and personnel in several African nations where they maintain a significant presence. Cyber attacks against Ukrainian critical infrastructure and Western government computer systems increased dramatically in both frequency and sophistication. Russian diplomatic pressure intensified on several neutral nations to restrict support for Ukraine. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Russia moves multiple pieces on multiple boards simultaneously, it typically means something larger and more coordinated is underway, something that extends beyond the battlefield in Ukraine. Intelligence analysts and military strategists are now actively considering several possibilities for what Russia ultimately intended with this repositioning. One is that Russia is genuinely preparing for a major spring offensive designed to capture key strategic cities and consolidate control over contested territories before the summer campaign season. Another is that Russia is attempting to force Ukraine into an entirely defensive posture, pinning down Ukrainian forces and preventing them from launching their own offensive operations while Russia reconstitutes its battered units. A third possibility, and the one worrying senior officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to provoke an escalation that would justify broader military action, potentially including threats regarding tactical nuclear weapons or direct confrontation with NATO assets. But today, Ukraine took that escalation card off the table. They didn't wait for lengthy diplomatic consultations that might have delayed action. They didn't defer to Western caution or requests for restraint. They didn't allow the Russian buildup to mature into a fully operational offensive threat. They struck first, struck hard, and struck with devastating precision. What we're watching unfold now is fundamentally a test of wills between major powers. Russia wants to see whether Ukraine can be intimidated or exhausted into territorial concessions. Ukraine wants to demonstrate that no amount of military repositioning or threatening rhetoric will change their fundamental resolve to defend their sovereignty. NATO wants to prevent any escalation that could draw member states into direct military conflict with Russia, and China is watching carefully to see how American credibility and commitment hold under sustained pressure, with obvious implications for their own calculations regarding Taiwan and the broader Indo-Pacific region. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence officials across multiple allied nations who are now actively monitoring Russian military command frequencies for any signs of how Moscow will respond to Ukraine's devastating strikes. They say Russian logistics chains have been significantly disrupted across at least 3 major supply routes that were essential for sustaining the repositioned forces. They say emergency repair crews have been deployed to damaged facilities throughout the night, but that full restoration of operational capability could take weeks or even months. And they say Russia's decision to massively reposition forces was likely part of a broader pressure campaign specifically intended to test Western resolve during an American election year when political attention is divided. But Ukraine is not backing down. In fact, Ukraine is doubling down. Their response today, swift, precise, and devastatingly effective, sent a clear message to Russia that attempts at intimidation will be met with immediate and overwhelming military action. And it sent an equally important message to Western allies that Ukraine remains a capable, reliable and proactive partner worthy of continued support. As the night continues and dawn approaches over the battlefield, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russia hoped to achieve with this massive and provocative repositioning of military forces. But what we already know with certainty is that the Pentagon's warning was both timely and consequential. It prepared allies across NATO for what was coming. It enabled rapid and coordinated intelligence sharing that enhanced Ukraine's targeting, and it gave Ukraine the strategic and political cover to respond aggressively without fear of losing Western support. What happens next will depend entirely on what Russia decides to do in the next 48 to 72 hours. If they pull back and de-escalate, this moment will be remembered as yet another failed Russian gambit that cost them dearly in equipment and credibility. If they choose to escalate further despite the setbacks, Ukraine and the entire Western alliance have already demonstrated they are ready to respond. They have shown they are prepared to meet every escalation with consequences. They have shown they are ready to respond decisively. And tonight, for the first time in many months, Russia appears to be genuinely on the defensive, reacting to events rather than controlling them. The Kremlin is quiet tonight, too quiet. And when Russia is quiet after suffering significant military setbacks, it means they are recalculating their options. It means they are choosing their next move with unusual care. Because tonight, Russia learned something they have been forced to learn many times since February 2022, that Ukraine does not break under pressure, that Western weapons fundamentally change the military equation, and that underestimating Kyiv remains the most dangerous strategic mistake the Kremlin continues to repeat. This story is far from over, but tonight, one thing is absolutely clear. The Pentagon's warning was heard around the world. Ukraine's response was swift, decisive, and devastatingly effective, and Russia's attempted gambit has, at least for now, failed to achieve its intended objective. And we will be here, watching every detail, reporting every development, as the next phase of this historic confrontation unfolds.